Welcome to episode number 21 of the You Understood podcast. I'm delighted to welcome Nathalie Jones to the podcast, who, I'm going to let you describe yourself and your expertise. So how would you describe that for our listeners?
So I am a dietitian. I've worked in Glasgow the last 20 years or so. Kind of over my career, got a particular interest in mental health. So really working with people, kind of either NHS, different charities, voluntary organisations, private practice, and just making sure that people get the most out of their diet. But that goes so far beyond just telling them what to do, and it goes so far beyond just giving information, because I think nowadays we can get information, some of it's not accurate, but we can find out a lot of stuff, but it's very much about me getting to know the person and what's going to work for them, and it being a real kind of collaborative work in them being an expert in themselves and me tapping into that. I
love that. Rather than forcing stuff on people kind of in a uniform fashion, you're actually understanding the context of the individual first of all, right? That's the starting point. I've got to say, like me, we've both been in Scotland now for 20 years, and you can tell from the accents, can't you?
Yeah.
we haven't picked that up, have we?
No.
Not yet.
I mean, I don't notice English accents. I just think of them as what I know. Like, I don't notice it being different.
Nutrition dietitian, like, was that planned in your life? Was it something you just had always a passion for, or is it something you kind of fell into?
No, like very little of what I do career-wise is planned.
Oh, really?
Very, very, okay. I mean, even just doing this today, very unplanned, really. You kind of come up with ideas and we kind of follow them. And I think I know quite instinctively when something's working and when something works well and when something's of value. And it's really important for me to be able to add value, you know, whether that is something like a podcast like this or working with somebody individually. So no, nothing is planned. Really, I fall upon things, and when they work, I follow that path. And that often brings off other little tributaries of paths I can then follow. So that's how I work.
So essentially kind of follow your intuition and your experience as to what works and what doesn't.
Yep.
And have you found yourself, because, you know, when I was thinking about the topics we could touch upon today, and more so, you know, what was I interested in as a layman, but what would the listeners be interested in? I suddenly just, you know, you have that penny drop moment where it's bloody vast, isn't it? Like, you can disappear down rabbit holes left, right and centre. So we'll get into all of that, I think, because there's lots of generic questions that I perceive the listeners may want to ask someone like you, but they never have the opportunity to do so, right? So we'll get into that. But have you found yourself staying kind of general in diet, or have you found yourself back to the way that life works out for you, kind of veering in a particular direction with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of initially I was interested in weight management, and that's been a kind of real common kind of thread throughout all my work, really. But also a lot of the kind of behaviour change stuff associated with weight management. So not so much about getting somebody on a diet, although I do support people with that, but also thinking, well, actually, how's their weight affecting their life? How's their lifestyle choices affecting them? The bigger picture of it, and then working with them to change that. And, you know, one of the first things I often get people to do when they're making behaviour change is looking at that, writing a kind of what's in it for me list. Like, what do I get out of this? And kind of exploring that motivation. And with weight management is a massive mental health part of that. And a lot of people come to that with lots of kind of trauma behind them, a lot of kind of adverse life experiences, adverse childhood experiences. And that's also developed me into kind of working in eating disorders and working in other, which actually, when we're looking at kind of the dietary impact of that, people make a lot of choices that aren't particularly helpful for them, or kind of how often I call kind of healthful for people. The causes are the same and the problems are the same. It's just people do it in a different way, you know.
Got it.
So started with weight management, and that's kind of developed into mental health interest.
And this might sound a bit of a strange question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You talked about motivation of the individual, and you know, the way I perceive that is the motivation cognizant? So is it kind of shallow or deep? So let me explain. So do people come in just saying, look, I want to lose weight, as an example, of heading in that direction. I know there's the other direction as well, and we can touch upon that. But I want to lose weight because I just want to look better, to be perceived in a more positive light. So is it about others perceiving them, or is it more cognizant in terms of, look, I need to do this? The benefits of looking better are great, but actually the core reason that I want to do something here is health, right? Whether that be physical health or mental health. But I guess, is it a cognizant kind of motivation, or does it really vary depending on the individual?
I don't think people always know. I think people will often, initial email will be, I need to lose weight because my blood pressure's high, or I need to lose weight because I can't fit into my clothes and I feel awful, or this is the 10th time I've done it. I think you kind of touched on that, sort of for other people, or, that kind of external motivation. And I think over my experience working with people who need to lose weight or who want to lose weight, it's very important to know why someone's doing something and the potential harm that weight loss could cause. So for example, somebody might say, well, I need to lose weight because I feel awful about myself and I feel really shameful and I feel that other people judge me. Now, it would be very easy to put somebody on a diet and get them to lose weight. The difficulty is that most people regain weight once they've lost it. And my worry, which I would share with that person, is yes, we could get you to lose 2 stone, 3 stone, whatever it happens to be, and you could feel brilliant. But if you can't keep that up, what's that doing to you? Is this going to be another failed attempt? Is this going to be another dent to your self-esteem that I've let myself down again? The comments that people will often make about weight, somebody loses weight, oh, you're doing brilliantly, really, really positive. Don't you look amazing? Haven't you got, and you feel great. And then that shame that can follow when that person then inevitably gains that weight back, because it is a normal process of weight management when somebody loses weight and then gains some of that back at least. And I'll discuss that with the person of, okay, well, how do we do things differently now to what we did before? Because this isn't just about willpower. And people will often say, I just need to know how to do it, or I need to be stronger, or I need you to be there and track me and all that sort of thing. And that's fine, but it's very temporary.
Yes.
And it's making sure that we're doing the right treatment plan that's going to help that person as a whole person, not just fixing what they think is the problem. Because some of it might be some work in body acceptance of that. We know quite a lot about kind of set point. People have a biological set point, like you've got blue eyes or I've got brown hair, that you reach a certain height, and that's genetically predetermined, and it's kind of predetermined also in our kind of health experiences as going through when we're growing. But trying to change that's very different, and if somebody's naturally a size 16 and actually they want to be a size 8, they could get to that, but they'd be really ill at that, likewise, vice versa. So helping somebody accept their body and being kind of body positive is kind of almost a kind of flippant kind of word with it. Yeah. But that acceptance of where are we at the moment, and also where do we feel healthy?
That's the first time I've heard anyone, and I'm 50 years old, right? It's the first time I've heard anyone kind of link, body to kind of genetic position. And I don't know, I probably have heard it before, but the penny kind of just dropped there a little bit, because we can't do anything really about the colour of our eyes or our height, and yet we expect to be able to morph our body and shape it in a way that pleases us and pleases society. So I guess there's a balance there, though, isn't there? Because number one, hearing that as somebody, who may want to shift a few pounds, you can go down the route to say, that's just me, that's my genetic makeup, that's how I'm meant to be, and learn to accept that. But there's also a kind of a danger of a lack of accountability and responsibility somewhere in there as well. And getting that balance right must be incredibly difficult, and something that you're trying to achieve all the time with the individual, right?
Yeah, and I think focusing on what feels okay to that person. So what feels okay physically, what feels okay mentally, also what feels okay, what is okay, not in terms of kind of their health and other parameters. So, if somebody's got type 2 diabetes and their blood pressure's high, we know that weight loss will help that person.
Got it.
When we're looking at how someone feels physically, how hungry are they? How do they feel after a meal, for example? In terms of sort of symptoms, things like, I don't know, bloating or any other kind of feelings that people have after food, or kind of lethargy or feeling more energized or whatever. How do people feel in terms of hunger, but also mentally, if they're going to a cafe and their friend's eating a cake and they're not eating a cake, how do they feel about that? Some people won't give a monkeys, other people will be proper resentful about that. So it kind of depends on like how someone's feeling. And, often I'll do with some people kind of weekly check-ins. So they'll text me their weight every week. I can see what's happening. They can see what's happening. And if they're losing weight, maybe more than what I think they should be losing or what they could be losing, my questions are, how are you hunger-wise? How are you energy-wise? And how are you brain-wise? So how are you could you do it, but you don't want to carry on doing it for too long? Or I can do it for a month, but I'm not doing it for a year. So how does it feel on that person? And, we know set point in a way. The best example is, if somebody gets food poisoning and they lose a stone, that weight comes on pretty quickly again, because when they get better, they feel hungry and they naturally go back to about that kind of weight. Likewise, Christmas happens and you eat loads for a week or two and you gain a stone. But then kind of naturally, without doing too much, you kind of go back to that weight again. Now, people do gain over years anyway for lots of reasons, but people tend to have a weight that they feel all right at and that it feels healthy.
And what's your view generally on, the direction of travel for weight, specifically in kind of, developed countries? What's contributing to that generally in your view? Is it, one or two key things, or is there you talked about kind of mental health and cognizance of everyday life and connection to physical self and spirituality is in there as well. But why do you think we've got a particular challenge in the more developed countries? Can you put your finger on it?
I think it's that food's available everywhere and people don't prioritise it. And it's just, I remember, I'm, not old, I'm 47, nearly 47. And, I remember a time where you'd maybe go to a petrol station and your parents would be filling up petrol and there wouldn't be a load of chocolate there. Whereas now it's quite common. You fill your car up, oh, there's something there, you just take it. And it's that availability where people eat on the go a lot. How many people actually sit down and eat lunch? How many people are just walking down the street eating a sandwich because they've just got it? And, have they eaten a sandwich? Have they had 2 sandwiches? It's kind of hard to sometimes remember what we've had because it's not a conscious act. It's something that food's just available, and we're not always thinking of it in that kind of healthful way of actually, what is this food giving me, and how satisfied am I from having that? And I think and
that's a connection thing. That's a lack of connection. So on the You podcast previously, I've talked about a general lack of connection that's kind of, or the connection is dissipating. So we're less connected to our environments because we live in, or the natural world, because we kind of live in these urban, cities. That's where most of the populations are. So there's a lack of connection, or a dissipating connection with the environment. I would say that we're not in touch or in tune with our bodies in terms of being aware of, if we're tired, how many times have we, sat on the couch really tired, but, there's another hour of the movie to go, right? And so we sit up and we watch that. So again, there's another example of where we're not listening to what our body's telling us. But I think the same is true with diet and nutrition. Is, you're right, there's an abundance of, we can call some of it food, right? And maybe question other stuff, but there's an abundance of it. And because it's available, because it's relatively cheap, and we can get calories from it, we're not really aware. And so when you talked about the challenges of weight gain over time, or specific instances where you revert back to a set point in either direction, there's this unhelpful unconsciousness, I think, that is prevalent in today's society, that it's almost like we're trying to fix, climate's another example, you've started me off now, but we're trying to fix the outcomes, and we're not looking at actually what's causing those things in the first place. And you did touch on it at the beginning in terms of underlying experiences that might lead to unhelpful behavior, but it almost becomes too big to tackle when there's a societal issue, I guess. Do you hold those kind of thoughts, or do you view it differently?
No, I think when we're looking at, rather than kind of putting a plaster on it and going, right, let's just fix this and you should just eat this way and that will work, which it will in terms of short term, but approaching it in a much more kind of compassionate way and thinking about actually how do you feel as an individual before you're eating? How do you, if you're hungry, you need food, respect that your body's telling you you're hungry. What would be a helpful thing to have? And if that means sitting down with, I don't know, my favourite is like eggs and avocado on toast. Do that quite a bit.
Very nice.
That gives kind of very nice. keeps you nourished.
Yep.
It's quite a quick thing to have, and it's giving me also time to eat and be aware when I'm hungry, when I'm full. And one example I give to people, because a lot of people often don't even know what hunger is anymore.
No.
They eat before that happens.
Absolutely.
Or eat in anticipation.
Yep.
People with eating disorders have to learn hunger again because they have messed their body cues up so much by starvation, or the fact that when they eat, it has so many other kind of emotional impacts to how they are, to how they approach their food and how they feel about it.
Yeah.
It skews those cues. And sometimes I ask people to think of, if they've got kids or if they know of kids, like what a 5-year-old child does. And what a 5-year-old child does is they eat when they're hungry and they stop when they're not, and not even when they're full, but basically when that hunger goes away, because they've got far more interesting things to be doing.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating to a parent because they give them their food and that 5-year-old kid eats half of it. Suddenly the hunger cue isn't there anymore. They're not interested. They want to go and play Lego or do whatever they want to do. 2 hours later, they're hungry again. And I understand that with adults, we can't do that because we're working and we can't just eat every 2 hours. But that kind of feeling of, if we're hungry, respect that, give ourselves what we need, wait till we're next hungry again, and kind of work on being intuitive with it. And for some people, when they overeat, I'll say, well, you know what, just halve your portions, see what happens. Mm-hmm. And people can be really surprised at that because people eat the same, size amount of pasta from when they're 20 to when they're 60. Metabolism has dropped, so they're not doing as much, but they just eat that same habit. So actually eat half. The worst that's going to happen is in half an hour you're going to be hungry again.
Yeah.
Fine, finish it off.
Yeah.
But most of the time people aren't.
It's kind of like we unlearn the good behaviour. It's such a shame, isn't it? Really, some of it, because actually it's quite simple. I think. So in terms of the food that's available, I talked about perceived complexity, and where I think we lose people, and I'm interested in kind of getting your thoughts on this, is, people can largely cope, and again, there's a view on this particular point, can largely cope with saying, okay, I get tracking calories as an example, as a guide to, whether I'm over consuming or under consuming. I get that principle, and, I can track it, and maybe that'll help me, maybe it won't. But as soon as you start to get into, recommended intake of protein and fiber and fats, and then goodness knows the types of fats, and so is there generally does that scare people off from the right behaviors, or actually does that not matter so much as long as you've got an overall awareness in your view, and I'm talking about, does it matter in terms of a generically healthy lifestyle?
I mean, I'll use the phrase that your diet doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be good enough. It needs to work for you. It needs to satisfy your hunger. It needs to satisfy your desire for food. It needs to keep you healthy. It needs to be able to support the exercise that you do or the energy expenditure that you do through the day, and it needs to last. So if we think about kind of health impact on food, that happens over decades. It doesn't happen from what we ate Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of any given week, or what we ate in January of the year. So it's what we have over a long period of time. So often people will book appointments and ask specific questions. What kind should they be having, sweetener or sugar or fat or butter or margarine, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And I can answer those questions, but that's not usually the issue. And if we talk about what somebody's wanting from a session, or how they want to be, or what's going wrong at the moment, I'll tend to work diet plans around fixing those problems.
Okay.
If it's energy, it's about making sure they're getting enough fluid, it's making sure they're getting enough carbohydrate, not too much because then they feel sluggish, but enough in terms of portions and enough regularity, for example. If somebody's struggling with binge eating, for example, we need to make sure that they're eating before a binge time of day could be happening. So there's things that would probably help that person, but that generic advice that we hear about, I mean, something simple as something like 5 a day, like we hear about 5 a day. Now that's kind of plucked out of thin air, really. There's not a huge amount of evidence for it. I mean, generally, if people eat 5 a day, it's seen as an amount that is manageable for most people. And it gets more fibre in, it gets more vitamins in, it fixes a lot of problems. But who's to say someone else might be better off with 9 a day, or somebody else might be better off with 2 a day. If someone's getting loads of like wind and bloating, we do focus on reducing fibre a little bit. So it kind of depends on who the person is, what their symptoms are, and what we need, and particularly with things like weight. You spoke about kind of tracking calories, and I'll tend to do portion plans with people. So as well as having calories, they have like a certain amount of protein foods or carbohydrate foods and so on. But after that, it's about supporting that person to do it and thinking, well, we've got these amounts. How do you feel? Or I feel 90% okay, but this could be improved. Fine, we'll just tweak these numbers.
Okay, yeah.
So we're kind of fine tuning general advice to what works for one person.
And you talked about, again, kind of a lot of roads are leading back to, not everyone's the same, right? So when somebody comes to you and they ask for advice, understanding where they are, but also do they understand what works for them is a key piece. So following that train of thought, you've got all these, I'll call them fad diets, but they appear and pop up from all sorts of places, and there's very common ones. Your views on that are that I assume that they're actually quite unhelpful unless people try them and they feel particularly good and that they're beneficial. Like what's your view on all these kind of paleo and just suddenly going plant-based, or whatever it is that helpful narrative out there? Or
so it can be to some people, and I will often say to people, well, what's worked before, or what have you done before? And if they've got a way that, let's say, for example, they've done a low-carb diet. I tend not to do a lot of low-carb diets with people. But if somebody is doing that and they say, well, actually, that really works, I'm not going to say, oh, actually, no, just do it my way. So there's the evidence, and then there's that what works for that person. And I mentioned at the beginning about that person being an expert in themselves. They've lived their body. They've lived their mind. They know what works and what doesn't work.
Yep.
I might challenge those things or explore those things. So for example, someone might say, well, a low carb diet really works for me. And I'd say, well, are you doing it now? No, I'm not doing it now. Why not? Well, I was too hungry. Right. Okay. So it might not have worked completely. It might have done some things.
Yep.
What did you find helpful? Well, I found my bloating reduced, or I found this helped, but actually I was really hungry and it was a total pain when my birthday came and I couldn't eat a cake, that kind of thing. So then we go, well, actually, we know that low carb generally works. How can we adapt it so that you can keep doing this?
Yeah.
So there's the evidence, and then there's what works for a person. And I will challenge conversations and challenge belief, because people often don't know, and they'll say, well, actually it worked. The only thing, all I need you for is to make me do it. Well, short of having me in their life forevermore.
Which is,
you couldn't do it.
You couldn't do it. And,
no.
and the kind of framework post advice is a different set of challenges, isn't it? The framework for success, as in enduring success, is a different set of challenges, because it relies on so many different things, environment, the people around you, circumstance, which we're not in control of, so there's all sorts of things that can kind of derail that support framework afterwards. Knowing what to do and doing it are two very different things. So I've got to tell the listeners how we bonded. It's going to be very strange, but I'm going to talk about our bond over Marmite, over our love of Marmite. But it leads into an actually quite an interesting topic. So as you know, but for the benefit of the listeners, I'm an asthmatic, and I have always loved Marmite, absolutely love it. But I guess it started in my mid-20s, and I noticed, in fact, I didn't notice straight away, but I had a reaction when I had Marmite and toast. And it started as quite a mild asthma attack. I could feel it kind of emerging, and it didn't develop. But the more I went back to Marmite, because I loved it so much, then it started to get quite serious, and I was actually having asthma attacks. And I know you have a similar experience, but you've decided to just stop that altogether. But I guess the question is allergies in general. So we hear about really quite sad and fatal allergies, for example, nut allergies. But where does one start with that in terms of what I'm thinking is, my allergy clearly manifests itself in, inflammation, right? Ultimately, and I can't help but think that there's probably other foods and diets that I'm ingesting that are having some sort of inflammatory response, and some I will be able to see, as in the Marmite one, which is really quite obvious, and my body's saying, what the hell are you doing? And there might be ones that aren't particularly helpful, but I'm not aware of them. So, generally, allergies, is that a growing problem? Is it just that we're more aware and more knowledgeable of them? And what can we do as individuals to understand what foods might be unhelpful to us?
Yeah, so there's differences between like allergies and intolerances. So allergies I tend not to deal with. So it's a very sort of specialist part of dietetics. So an allergy could be shown up as an immune response. So people will often have allergy tests, and they'll put little bits of the allergen on their arm, and they can sort of see whether it comes off. Okay. So that's showing like an immune response to it, and they can kind of show it in blood tests. Intolerances don't have that. So an example would be something like, or two alternatives could be someone might say, I'm allergic to dairy. Well, is that a dairy allergy? So are you producing an immune response to that? And that could show up as rashes, for example. Or is it a lactose intolerance? Actually, is it not an allergy to a protein? Yep. It's not a cow's milk protein allergy. It would be a lactose intolerance. So that could be something that's transient, that could come and go, or you could be born with it. So certain ethnic groups, for example, are more likely to have like lactose intolerance.
Okay.
If somebody had food poisoning, they'd have a temporary lactose intolerance. Or is it a sign of something else like celiac, for example, which is uncontrolled, where maybe they've got a gluten allergy, and because they've got a gluten allergy, they're now not able to digest the lactose. So it's a kind of secondary problem based on the first issue.
Yep.
So in answer to your question about, would we know about it, most allergy responses you know about, and the result is quite severe, and it can get worse. Okay. So usually it's kind of the second exposure, from what I remember, that you would get the response to. Right. Intolerances are more things that wouldn't show up on a blood test, but people notice it. Right. So particularly with things like kind of gut symptoms, so kind of wind, bloating, tummy stuff, and that can often be like an intolerance. You can have something like celiac. You can have something called silent celiac, where you don't get any symptoms from it, but you still have it, and that's like an autoimmune condition. So the only way of knowing that was usually like if somebody didn't get any obvious symptoms but became anemic because they weren't absorbing iron, they might then get checked for that, because it's a kind of common cause of anemia. And they would then know because they've had a biopsy or a blood test on that. So it kind of, yes, I suppose you could develop an allergy to any kind of protein. I suppose when I'm dealing with it, I'm dealing with what is the symptom that someone's getting, and then how can we fix that? So like the Marmite thing, for example, I was like, I'm sure I'm allergic. Apparently it's impossible to be allergic to Marmite, but it's not, because I am and you are, so that's two people. But I remember when I mentioned it to a doctor, they were like, well, just don't have Marmite. And that's an easy solution. And I think with something like that, it doesn't matter. But if you thought, well, you had an allergy to all fruit and veg, for example, and you just cut that out of your diet, that could have implications, whereas not having Marmite doesn't really do anything to anybody.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Apart from being a bit upsetting.
Yes, very
Marmite.
upsetting.
Yes, exactly.
Very upsetting.
But, it doesn't do anything. So I suppose it's when people are having to, or that they suspect they have a problem with a food and they just cut the entire thing out. And that can be when it's helpful to see a dietitian, because people will say something like, oh, I don't eat wheat. I've got a problem with gluten and I don't eat wheat, for example.
Okay.
And then I look at their food diary and there's wheat all over the place. So there isn't pasta and there isn't bread and there isn't cakes, but there's traces of wheat in ready meals that they're having, in ingredients that they're having. And that can be quite helpful for the person, because actually you've been having these and you're symptom free. So this would imply it's not a wheat allergy.
Yep.
It might be an intolerance based on volume.
Yeah.
So maybe you've done half the job already by reducing the wheat in your diet, but maybe we could introduce it sometimes and it might be okay because you're actually having it here, and you're okay on that.
Yeah.
So it's, again, using that person with their experience of how they find things and how their body feels, and then looking at what they're eating and saying, well, actually, maybe that way you've been thinking, you're kind of halfway there, but we could change it slightly to make your life easier.
And is that kind of challenging the person to challenge themselves on their own thoughts as well?
Yeah.
To an extent, yeah.
Because
yeah.
we say things to ourselves and then we believe them.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think, we've talked about a lot of, and maybe unfair to say kind of first world dietary issues and challenges, but there are some kind of extreme ends to what can go wrong when things escalate in all manner of ways. I just wonder, you've got some history and experience there, and without going into too much detail, but can you bring some of those more severe cases just to life in terms of how it can manifest itself if it's not caught early? And I'm guessing there's kind of both ends of the extreme there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in terms of, eating disorders, people see that as a kind of diet that's gone too far, and it's not really the case.
Okay.
Most people go on, most people have been on a diet in their life, and most people I've known have been on a diet, whether that's just losing Christmas pounds or whether that's a proper diet or whatever it happens to be.
Yep.
Most people have tried that. Most people lose a bit of weight and they gain it back again. And everything kind of works, as in they eat less, a bit like that 5-year-old child thing. They eat less, their body notices they're eating less, they get hungry, they miss the takeaway, and they crack. And they eat it again, and their body will. So most of the time things work. When it doesn't work is when there's kind of other triggering factors.
Okay.
So when there's other things. So people I would see with a severe eating disorder may well have a trauma background. They may well have had a trigger for that beginning. They may have a particular kind of perfectionistic kind of personality trait.
Okay.
And those people, when they restrict, will often be then at risk of using that restriction in an unhelpful way. So people with eating disorders, with kind of restrictive eating disorders, will often talk about that kind of numbing that will happen. It will, if someone is a perfectionistic type of personality, dieting lends itself very well to that calorie counting, things being good, things being bad.
Yeah.
The kind of messages we get, through the media or through kind of government campaigns, COVID was a particularly big example of that, we had people who were dying tended to be overweight, they tended to have type 2 diabetes. There was a higher risk with that. Big government campaign to watch weight at a time where people were isolated, at a time where things were out with our control, and eating disorders add a solution to that for a lot of people. And when people are in it, it's very, very difficult for them to get out of it again. And it's something that I'm very aware of in my weight management, in my kind of, when I'm working with overweight people, of actually what's the risk of this person losing weight? Because there is risk, and the risk is that for some of those people, they could develop an eating disorder, and I've just given them the tools to do it. Often the time when we're helping somebody to lose weight, the behaviours we're encouraging are quite disordered. Even self-monitoring, that's a really helpful mechanism for weight management. It's can be helpful in eating disorder treatment, but quite often at the beginning it's used as to feed the eating disorder as opposed to challenging it.
Goodness.
So it's about thinking myself, and also I will discuss my thought process with the person I'm working with of, okay, if we do this, what's the risk? What could go wrong? And we know that with some people, weight loss itself is a trigger for an eating disorder development. So if we think about how people with eating disorders will often think, they will obsess about food. They will often look at pictures of food, think about food all the time. They'll think about their next meal. They will watch what other people are eating. Now, these are all biological, kind of physiological drives. So our interest in food goes up when we're losing weight.
Right.
But if we think about how an average person is on a diet, that's exactly what they do.
Yeah.
They think about when their next meal is. They might
course.
spend ages looking at new recipes. They care about whether other people are losing weight. What are they eating? Is what they're doing normal? So when we're losing weight, we all develop slight eating disordered traits. Most of us don't keep that up because everything else is quite okay.
Yeah.
But when we have other risk factors, it is triggering. And I've had people who have lost weight for completely different reasons. So a patient of mine, once she was on it was a drugs trial for something completely different.
Yeah.
She volunteered of her own goodwill.
Yeah.
She took this medication. This medication, a side effect was weight loss. They didn't know it was, but it was. She lost 2 or 3 stone, triggered eating disorder. This is somebody who was in her mid-50s, hadn't had any known eating disorder in the past, and that weight loss itself triggered that. So I think my experience with eating disorders has made me approach my weight management work quite differently.
Yeah.
And probably more responsibly than I would have done 15 years ago.
And I'm hearing as well that there's probably, as you get into that, there's probably a wider ecosystem that has to come into play as well. So it stops just being about, diet and nutrition, and potentially starts to deal with things like trauma or behavioural issues, or things like addiction. But I'm guessing there's a kind of a wider ecosystem that really manifests itself for the benefit of the person in that case.
Yeah, and speaking to them about what they see their risk could be. What if somebody has, an example would be somebody's had an eating disorder in the past 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now they're overweight and they're wanting to control that. There'd be a lot of conversation between me and them of, okay, what weight were you then? What weight were you ever happy at for a couple? How do we know it's getting wrong? What is unhelpful to you? Is weighing yourself unhelpful, or is it helpful?
Yeah.
And when do we know risk is happening? And managing that in an open way. And things like people having, where people have kind of an eating disorder, they would need to be under a therapist anyway. So they'd have kind of whether that's sort of CBT or kind of trauma related therapy.
Okay. So that would
alongside.
exist already in most cases.
It would have to. If somebody had a high risk eating disorder, dietitians don't work on their own with them. They would have a psychological therapist as well.
And something I'm hearing throughout this whole podcast, really, and I love to hear it, is you're very consultative with the individual. You're not disempowering them. In fact, the opposite. You're taking, you're listening to them. You're taking their experience of themselves in and amongst consideration of all the other data. And I don't know whether that's standard. I hope it is, but I applaud you for it, because it's something that I hear where people are disempowered. It becomes, really challenging. So for them to feel part of any process, I think is absolutely crucial in the success of anything. So I absolutely love it. I love it.
I mean, when it comes to people who have been overweight a lot of their life, or people who have had eating disorder and been very underweight all their life, the stigma is massive, and people are often very used to being told what to do by health professionals, and they're almost come to me and make me do it.
Right. Okay.
I need you to tell me what to do. Some people say, I need you to give me a row when I'm not losing weight. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that, but let's see how else I can support you, because what I'm hearing is you're needing somebody who's got your back, basically.
And the danger of that, again, is that those individuals are coming to others to fix them versus understanding that actually the answer probably lies within them, with help, of course, and guidance, but ultimately it lies within them to understand the best way forward. So I think that's an important point. You touched upon mental health at the beginning and how it was important. So can you talk about how you see diet and nutrition impact positively or negatively on somebody's, whole demeanor, whole way they look at life, and just, if you can, some real world examples, but if not, just your views on how getting diet right can actually lead to a really healthier lifestyle mentally, not just physically.
Yeah. And that's something that I would cover even when somebody doesn't bring up mental health. So what we find and what most of us can relate to is that a couple of meals of eating healthfully, of giving you what you need, you feel better, and you feel better quite quickly. Likewise, when I went out for a Chinese meal the other day, I had a lovely time having a Chinese meal, but I felt a bit rubbish afterwards. And I certainly wasn't going to go for a walk afterwards. I sat there and was quite grateful that Love Island was going to be on telly. And I thought, I'll just sit there.
Getting an insight now. So you're getting an insight.
Yeah. It's not all deep, no. But yeah, it's kind of thinking, how does someone feel about something? And in terms of mental health, we're never going to fix it with diet, but what we can do is stop diet being a limiting factor.
Okay.
So if we are feeling low mood and we're not able to sleep at night, and then we sleep into 1 in the afternoon, and then half the day's gone, and then it's actually winter, so we've only got 3 more hours of daylight, and we just get a takeaway, that amount of nutrition we're going to be able to get in that amount of time until that person then falls asleep again at 3 a.m. isn't going to be them cooking, because the likely thing is they'll be on their own.
Yes. Yeah.
And they'll just be ordering something in or just snacking or whatever.
Yeah.
If for that person, that example, we could say, well, actually, you're going to be waking up at 1, let's not change that bit of it, but can we start with cereal? Something basic that actually, the better quality cereals get you like a third of a lot of your vitamins anyway. Okay. So little examples like that, saying, okay, well, can we just make sure that we're eating every 3 hours? And you set your clock by it, that's all you're going to do. And you're going to have the option of these 4 things. And it might be cereal, it might be eggs on toast, it might be basic stuff. It might be a ready meal, and ready meals are not awful. Yep. They may well be better than the alternative of not having anything or just having a load of takeaways. But what can we do to stop diet being a limiting factor? So, getting our blood sugars regular, making sure that we're feeling satisfied from our food, that we've got enough energy to be able to leave the house. Can we actually combine that that daily plan of, I'm going to have my cereal in the morning, even if that's Cocoa Pops, but you're having something that's getting some nutrition in, and then I'm going to go for a walk. So you're kind of combining fueling, activity, fresh air. When that person's outside, the chances are they might see another human, and that's going to be helpful. Shock horror. I know, exactly. Rather than being at home. So it's making sure that it's thinking, well, what can we do with your diet? And the good thing about approaching it this way is people feel better quite quickly. So 2 to 3 days of eating better. And
that gives them a kind of a step to better stuff, right? Yeah. Good. Okay. So before we wrap up, some common stuff that I was thinking about, and you've touched upon one of them already, the 5 a day vegetables. I'm thinking of fruit and vegetables. I'm thinking about kind of, guidelines on water intake. Lots of that stuff's out there. It sounds to me like you're more of a realist. So you're kind of, not a stipulator of, sticking to everything in kind of minutiae amounts of detail, but, just kind of be cognizant, be as balanced as possible, be as sensible as possible, keep checking, so that circular checking in, what's working, what's not working, understand that environmental factors play a role, and it's not just nutrition in isolation, and you just talked about that as it relates to mental health. But is that your approach generally, or again, does it differ depending on the individual you're seeing? So you I love the give me a row when I'm not doing example. Do you need to take that stance sometimes? Because actually, talking about common sense actually isn't applicable in some cases? Or do you find that actually people know what the right thing to do is, but they don't necessarily follow that road?
Yeah, I mean, a question I will say to somebody is about, what do you want from me? Like, what would be helpful?
Okay.
And it might be, I'm not going to shout at somebody over a text, but it might be that if they're wanting that actually we're in touch and you might help them monitor how their week's been or how their day's been or whatever, and we can look at
If you do
things.
shout, do you use capital letters and exclamation marks, or? You're thinking now.
It kind of depends on who the person is, because some
Of course.
people like it
Really?
a bit.
Okay.
But yeah, we just
Okay.
we just have to.
Right, I distracted you then.
Yeah. But yeah, sorry, what was the question in terms of?
In terms of the
variety.
common sense approach versus you can't apply that everywhere, right? So some people will be coming to you saying, I want a row when I don't do something.
Yeah.
Others will be looking for you to fix their issue and their challenge, and not understanding that actually a large part of it's got to come from them. So it sounds like you're just very practical and you're there for the individual.
Yeah.
Rather than prescriptive, you're actually saying, look, let's understand where we are. I'm the expert in terms of guidance here, but ultimately let's work together. So more collaborative is the best way.
Some people do just want like a meal plan, and I don't tend to do it that often, but if somebody just wants to be told what to do, I'll be like, if you want me just to tell you what to eat, and they're, oh yes please.
Okay.
If they want, I'll tell them what to eat, but I'll be really clear, you're going to get bored of this.
Yeah.
But we can do it to begin with. And sometimes that helps because people can get into quite a muddle of all these messages that they get of what they should be doing. But if they've told me what their goals are and they've told me what their difficulties are, I can say, well, actually, breakfast, 3 options, lunch, 3 options, dinner, 3 options. You will be bored, but at least that's delegated that bit of their brain to me. They don't have to think about it. They just eat it. And then when I see them again in a month and they're bored, we go, right, this is, is it working? Oh, yes, no, I feel better. Brilliant. Well, actually, you don't have to have a sandwich every day. You can have a baked potato, and this is how we do the portioning. So it's kind of, the messages that we hear aren't always applicable to everybody.
Yes. Which is the danger, right?
Yes.
Throughout society, I think.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll wrap up.
Okay.
But I guess I always ask this question at the end and put you on the spot somewhat. So don't worry. But if there was kind of one simple bit of advice that you could give somebody in terms of needing help, and just, but for clarity, we'll provide all of your contact details when we launch the podcast, right? So people can reach out. But is there kind of an overarching simple bit of guidance or advice based on your experience that you could say, look, if you do this, or you're cognizant of that, then actually you won't go too far wrong?
I think it's for somebody to think really carefully about what they're wanting.
Okay.
And if they were ever in that position before, what was life like then? And was it helpful, and can they replicate? So I think people change diets on a whim a lot, and they want to change something and it just has to be extreme. Whereas if it's something like weight, for example, and they want to be 12 stone or something, when were they last 12 stone? What was life like then? How much activity were they doing? What is happening now? And that is when things like food diaries and self-monitoring are quite helpful. Like even journal for a month, write down everything you eat and drink. And it's that awareness of what is now, because it's not just now is wrong. There'll be bits of now that are working fine, and there'll be bits that aren't working fine. And sometimes when I speak to somebody who's maybe just making initial contact and they're quite ambivalent, I'll say, well, do a food diary for a month, and then come back to me and have a think about what you're wanting and what would work. And I think it's about thinking things through before starting, because it's nothing more disheartening than changing diet and making a lot of effort for it then not to work.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that sprung to mind as you were talking. So what was life like back then in terms of, you want to get back there? you're not only looking at the diet behaviors and the nutritional values, you're looking at that environment and the context and the people and the circumstance, aren't you? And actually what potentially made that work is the combination of all those things, and does that exist today? So that's a really important point. And the other thing is, when you ask somebody what they want, also I guess why. Challenge themselves on why they want that, what they think that thing, that achievement is going to give to them. Often people use things to fill gaps that aren't necessarily or potentially kind of square pegs round holes type stuff. It may not be the only answer to fulfilling the why, I guess. But just a final thought. Nathalie, it's been absolutely wonderful. I've loved the conversation. Thank you so much. And just really, really good chat.
Okay,
Thank you. All right, cheers.